So welcome to our session at Instagrammer's Tale. We're happy to see so many of you here. My name is Kate Dawson. I work for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. If you haven't heard of us, we protect, create and restore wetlands in the UK and internationally. And we have 10 wetland sites around the UK. So in my role as content manager, I'm responsible for communicating our work through our media on our owned channels. One of which is Instagram, a fairly new channel for us. So I'm really excited to see what comes out of this session. So before we start, I just wanted to say, please feel free to ask questions on the chat throughout, as has been done with other sessions. So I'll be keeping an eye on this, and we'll have sort of pauses throughout the session where we address questions. But yeah, just feel free to just throw anything in as you think of it. There'll also be a chance at the end to go back and answer any questions that didn't get addressed. So yeah, let's get started. So I'll pass over to our speaker for this session. If you're on Instagram, you might be familiar with Lucy, aka Lucy Lapwing. So Lucy is a science communicator, and she has many thousands of followers on Instagram. She's also a self-proclaimed nature nerd. So welcome, Lucy, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Kate. And yes, thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining in and listening to me, hopefully not rambling too much. But the idea behind today's session is for it to be quite informal, just a bit of a to and a fro, bit of a question session, and just talk about Instagram kind of as a platform and how we can communicate on it using, I don't know, fun things, fun content, different tones of voice, and how it can be a tool to reach people with messages about the environment, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, science comms, and kind of everything in between. So I'm just going to do a couple of minutes at first with a little presentation. Sorry, it's not going to be death by presentation, hopefully today. That's just a little bit of kind of my Instagram story, if you can call it that. It's quite cringe and a little bit silly, but hopefully you can see how it started and how I don't try not to take myself too seriously. So this is a hopefully I hope you can see the presentation now. A screenshot of how I started off on Instagram. So as a fresh-faced 22-year-old out of uni about 6 years ago, so you can probably work out how old I am. Standard Instagram of a youngish person: dogs, dinner, nights out, hangover photos, outfits, that kind of thing. Standard Instagram for most people. And that was as I finished my kind of degree at university. I then got my first job in conservation. So I've worked now for the RSPB for 6 years in a professional capacity in a number of roles. And during this time that you can see in the photos here of that's Jelly the dog, by the way, my very cute dog, and other things going on. It was just kind of a standard piece of social media for me. If we could go to the next slide, please, to do an impression of our government ministers. Is that loaded, the next one? There we go. Okay. So straight to the bald hair. So this is towards the end of my first contract with the RSPB. I unfortunately got diagnosed with a rather annoying illness, Hodgkin lymphoma. And I think I got my diagnosis about 9 days before my contract ran out, which wasn't very convenient. It wasn't really a good time for me to start applying for new jobs. I couldn't really go to a new employer and say, oh, by the way, I'm going to have 3 or 4 days off every other week for some chemo. So I decided to take 6 months out of work. And at this point, I already considered myself somebody who was a nature lover, a wildlife nerd, but I didn't have that much natural history knowledge. And I didn't really focus on it a lot outside of work. My priority was still pretty much going to the pub and having fun. So if you could just click next again. This is this is me in the midst of my treatment, completely hairless, dressed up as Voldemort, having a little bit of fun. And this is the time that I started spending my free time every day when I wasn't feeling pretty crappy, outside and adventuring around in nature. So if we can go to the next slide. My Instagram at this point started to transform. So my strategy, my modus operandi, was to basically spend each day wandering around in the natural environment, finding bits of wildlife and photographing it. So you could see at this point I was kind of taking myself a bit seriously as a photographer. and putting really cringe Instagram filters on everything. But I started the process of transforming my Instagram from a document of my nights out to a document of some of the wildlife I saw. And at that point, it was mostly just a photograph with a bit of a label. I found this toad today, I've seen a peacock butterfly, etc. And then if we go to the next slide, it kind of grew from there. So this is as I kind of started dipping into the world of science communication, and I kind of fell into it without it really being a conscious decision. So my Instagram started transforming from just pretty photos of nature to actually talking about the subject in the photograph. I really, really enjoyed learning about it, and having a scientific degree, I kind of vaguely knew how to read quite scientific information about species. And from there, I really got into how do I translate that to your average person? When I was talking to my mates who have no interest in nature whatsoever, how do I make the behavior of a spider or a blue tit or anything else seem interesting to them? Because I can see how amazing it is. How do we get that across to people? So I'm not going to read this whole thing out, but I've highlighted in yellow here some of the words of where I try and use that really kind of informal language, human language and real language when I'm doing my science communication, if you can call it that. If you go to the next slide. Is that changing? You can appreciate this not fen raft spider, just raft spider that I found up in Scotland, which is one of my favourite creatures on the planet. They're absolutely stunning things. Has it gone to the next slide? I can't see. I've got a black screen. Maybe we're stuck. I'm just going to have to freestyle it. So yeah, so I started just basically upping the ante on the, there we go, on the comms front. So finding really, really nerdy topics in British natural history and finding a fun way to translate it to your average person on the street. Now, the really interesting thing for me about science comms is when you look at the average reading level of people in the UK, it's generally that of the reading level of a 9-year-old. It can, in some nerdy topics, go up to about the reading age of a 12-year-old, but that's really the level of information that we want to pitch it out if we want to get across something that's quite complex. So here I am talking about a symbiotic relationship between the larvae of a certain specific moth that lives inside beech leaves and a certain type of bacteria that lives inside that moth, but trying to make it interesting into something that every single person who happens across a beech tree in autumn could actually find quite interesting. So if we go across to the next slide. I think we've got a bit of a delayed reaction here. There we go. So this is how it's kind of looking now. So in the last year or so is when I've really upped the ante. So I'd say up until about 2018, it was more just kind of a pretty picture of nature blog. And in the last year, I've really focused my passion and enthusiasm and time on the information that accompanies the content, the visual content that I'm putting on Instagram. So at the moment, it's a mix of photos of all of my nature treasures and what I find. It's occasional photo of me to show a face behind the camera, as it were, if you can call it that. It's mostly just taken on my phone. And that was a really big step for me. So the actual process of putting my face out there, talking on camera, I think I did my first vlog, if you can call it that, my first story where I'm actually talking to the camera, I did in May 2019, so about a year and a half ago. And since then, the number of vlog stories I do, I'm delving into the world of reels, if we're going to touch that, and just kind of putting that personal front and that personality, just showing how much I actually love it. And I'm just a real person and a real nerd who gets stuck into things. So that's kind of the bit of the Instagram story. I think that's the end of my presentation. Very short, but a little bit of an idea of how I just, this is an example. Sorry, I forgot I had an extra slide of some of the recent stuff that I've done where I've delved into creating infographics and a little bit of information behind the species. So I was quite an enthusiastic emo as a 15-year-old. For those of you who remember MySpace and those golden old days, I used to design my own MySpace profile. So that's where I've got a bit of a hand of drawing things. And this is kind of the level that I've been going into recently. So really looking at not just the species information themselves, but the issues behind them, the conservation issues, the social issues. This is me having a pop at the British media's obsession of fear-mongering around spiders and every other insect, it seems, or invertebrate, should I say. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. I think that's the end of the presentation now, for sure. But yeah, hopefully a little bit of an idea of just how, for me, it started off as just an informal passion, something that I think is really important not to lose. to just put your personality across, to be human, and to just really enjoy yourself and not be afraid of being a little bit silly, a little bit humorous, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, and quite cheeky at times as well. So yeah, that's my kind of Instagram story.
Lucy, that's a really great insight. I was just wondering, when you mentioned that you sort of started doing vlogs and you started doing graphics, was there anything that sort of prompted that sort of change of intensity, or was that kind of just something that happened naturally?
I suppose, and this is quite depressing, I suppose it's just because I feel within society in the last 2 years or so, the gravity of the situation with the biodiversity crisis and the climate crisis seems to be really hitting home. We've heard of the rise of terms of things like eco-anxiety, and people really kind of feeling the weight of these issues. And just the urgency, the sense of urgency seems to have increased. So I just kind of thought, I'm not really doing enough. I need to do more. And I think the juxtaposition between how I see formal organisations communicating and how, you know, we constantly as conservation organisations preach about wanting to connect to new audiences and reach younger people and more diverse audiences and enthuse people. And then we just carry on in the same old tone of voice and the same old style of comms without just being more human about it. So I thought, I'm going to practice what I preach in work, outside of work, and just try and be a bit more fun and real.
Yeah, I think that's a really important topic that I think you're really good, well placed to talk about, seeing as you have your own personal Instagram account and have sort of spent some time experimenting with that, but you also work for a large NGO, so you've kind of got both sides of that experience. Before we kind of move on to that, there's quite a lot of questions coming in, so would you want to answer a few of those right now?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, do you want to pick some?
There's quite a lot of questions coming in about photography. I know you mentioned you sort of weren't a trained photographer or anything, and your main experience comes from your science background and training. There's a few questions coming in about how confident you were with photography when you started out, and sort of how important are photos for you? What comes first, the photos or the written content?
So that's a really good question. I will hold my hand up and say I have not got a bloody clue about photography. I point my camera at things and press a button on the top and it takes photo. That's literally as far as it goes. I'd say over 95% of my photos are taken on my phone. I have a little £2 clip-on macro lens that I use for like close-up shots of insects that you can get off like eBay. And that's about as technical as it gets. I tend to find a nice photo does help. What really, you know, it depends what your mission is on Instagram. Instagram's full of professional photographers with millions of followers who work for National Geographic or BBC Earth or everything in between, who see these amazing things and capture it visually. But I think in terms of trying to inspire people and instill emotion in them, I think if they can be connected to the wildlife on their doorstep and know that it's accessible, I think that's a really powerful thing. And I think photography can be particularly inaccessible to people. You do tend to find, and this is common throughout a lot of conservation organisations, is we're really good at using sexy photography that is taken on a kit that's worth £5 to £10, and you'll find the vast majority of photographers are a very standard demographic of older white men. And you know, if you think of your average person who might be getting into bird watching, a stunning photo of a kingfisher, that they're never realistically going to be able to see a kingfisher like that. You know, if you're looking at paid photography hides and things, but if I'm taking a photo on my phone that everyone's got a phone now, of a slug in my back garden, it's just that little bit more accessible. And especially when you twin it with that passionate writing, I tend to find, and this is a personal preference, a crap photo of something interesting with amazing excitement in the caption is a lot more engaging than a beautiful photo of something stunning that just says species name, camera settings. So, but that's just my opinion.
Do you think that's something that's quite not unique to Instagram, but quite emblematic of this channel, is this sort of like excitement and positivity and enthusiasm? Sort of, how does that compare to other social channels?
I'd say so, yes. So personally, I quit Facebook about 2 years ago, and it was the best thing I've done because it was just full of arguments between seemingly racist relatives, if I'm being honest. And I just, Facebook I found quite a negative emotional drain. Twitter I am active on, but I do think Twitter is just, I call it the argument platform. It's just somewhere you go if you want to have an argument with someone about something, and it can be about anything. Instagram is just a lot more positive. It's a place where communities naturally build. I think it's because so much of it is a visual element. I think there's less to discuss on the nuances of whatever you want to argue about. And I do just think it generally, in my experience, has a much more positive vibe.
Great. Couple of other questions, and thanks everyone for sending these through. Do you use hashtags? Is there a specific reason why you do or don't? I think lots of people have different attitudes to hashtags, and I feel like I'm never sure about how many or how little to use. Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, hashtags is an interesting one. I do use it, them, should I say. I don't think about them too much. I have a few different ones saved for like the main topics of things that I know I end up talking about. So I've got like a bunch of invertebrate hashtags saved in a note, a bunch of fungi-based hashtags, but I tend to find medium level ones. So if you click on a hashtag and open it, you can see that the number of photos under that. So if I go on hashtag nature photography, it'll have like 200 million photos. There's no point necessarily using that because so many people will put stuff on there and it'll be full of spam and adverts. But if you look at something like British wildlife or British birds, or I don't know, anything like that that's just a little bit more niche but will have interest from people who are interested in your topic, then I think it's best to go for that middle ground stuff. Not too niche. So like Latin names of species often will have like a couple of hundred photos. But yeah, that kind of in between ground I tend to use.
It depends on your audience, doesn't it, a little bit? Like, who are you trying to like reach? If you're using Latin names of birds, then you're definitely trying to really reach a certain group who would appreciate that.
And I'd say it's different to being an individual using Instagram and using hashtags for you to share your own content. And if you're working for an organization or have an organization page, I'd say hashtags are potential to be a really great tool. You can use that as a community building function to gather yourself content. I mean, how much time, I'm a comms officer for a charity, and I suppose you understand as well, how much time you spend gathering content and trying to think of content where people are making it every day. People are writing and photographing passionately wildlife on our nature reserves every day. And they're the type of people we keep saying we want to engage with. So, you know, if you've got an active hashtag that you actively source content from, people will then think, oh, I've got a chance of being shared by WWT, by RSPB, by whoever. They'll then proactively use it more and it will grow that hashtag. And I think not enough organizations do that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think one of the things that we wanted to discuss, sort of what is it, how can people use Instagram for science communications, and sort of how exactly have you used it to kind of make science communications more accessible? You mentioned kind of the age that we're aiming people at in terms of our writing style. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that, about sort of.
Yeah, so a lot of this is obviously very personal opinion, but I do believe in it. I just think we're often very scared as a sector, the environmental sector as a big sector, conservation sector too, of coming across as professional all the time. And I don't think informality, cheekiness, silliness and humour are completely exclusive from being professional. I often give the example of comedians. Like, you know, it's their job to stand up on stage and be silly and swear, and they're a professional. They do it as a job. And I think we don't often look at the light-hearted, humorous, cheeky side enough. And if you think of people who are completely independent to us, who've established, I'm saying us as organisations in the UK or around the world, who've established themselves as an online source of information that have caught up with us and excelled in terms of the numbers of people engaging. I'm thinking of like IFL Science and people like that, or groups like that share that humorous, crazy side of nature that's really like amazing. I think we need to just look more at that. And I mean, this is a personal frustration. I find that not enough conservation organisations use innuendos in nature to our example, which might seem tacky. But I mean, we've got a whole gang of bird called tits. Why don't we use that more? And you know, this isn't a personal opinion, but beavers ended up trending on Twitter, #1 hashtag a few weeks ago, off of the back of a media release about the successful beaver trial, which is amazing. The reason it ended up trending is because so many people who don't even know about issues to do with beavers saw it and was like, beavers, wait. And then it just took off and reached more people than it ever would have done. So yeah,
I think that's a really good point. I think you might be talking a little bit about beavers later as well. So I think there's a question from Sam Ridgway. How do you break out of the echo chamber of people already into wildlife? I think, and he said it was the focus to encourage other nature lovers to share their stories and do more action. I think what you've just said kind of touches on that first point a bit.
Yes, so the echo chamber is like my biggest fear, and I do still to a massive extent think that I sit in it deeply. I've tried to simplify my content, and this year there's just been this surge in people discovering nature for the first time. So I might not be necessarily converting people who are completely disconnected from nature straight to it, but people who are just dipping that little toe in. I'm trying to pitch at the level where it's totally understandable, because I do think, and my experience as a female in nature and bird watching in particular, how it can seem like this really kind of exclusive club, and people have like not in jokes, but people who have the knowledge keep the knowledge, and if you don't know the knowledge, then you're not in on the joke. Whereas I'll always try and, if somebody asks me what a bird is, I won't just say, oh, it's a Chetty's warbler. I'll say, oh, it's a Chetty's warbler, and this is how you can tell, because it's got that weird little tail and it's that funny colour, and sometimes you hear it and it sounds like this, and just really like invite people in and communicate with them more, and don't be afraid to explain everything. There are nerds out there that will, what I'm saying, nerd is a compliment, sorry, in my language, but that will understand what I'm saying, because I'm saying really basic stuff, but they'll still appreciate, my content. But there'll be people that have never heard of these words that I'm using, that I'm explaining, and so it just gets people in from outside the echo chamber that are already kind of headfirst into conservation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's so true, of people just thinking, oh, it's not for me because I don't know this, this and this, so I'm not even going to try. So I think it's really refreshing what you've been trying to do. It's obviously working as well, because people are following you who aren't necessarily from that background. So yeah, there's a lot of questions coming in here about how you kind of balance that sort of cheekier, more personal, open side with how you approach comms as an organisation, that it's not going to get sign off unless it's professional to a certain extent. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, and I get that massively. I think it'll just be a case of shoulders against the wheel in a changing tide, because young people now just do not speak the same language. We've got our traditional supporters in conservation that we do want to communicate with in an appropriate tone, but people who are change makers, young people, teenagers who are change makers, talk in completely different ways. And if you look at activist circles online and offline, it's so hard to talk about this without sounding like a really old person. Like meme culture, like memes, like people influence change and encourage their peers to vote in elections through memes. It's like this is how people influence change on the ground now, is by not having that fear. And brands are starting to take that on. So I find the conservation sector is particularly scared of changing our tone of voice. But if you look at Yorkshire Tea having a go at racist people earlier this year, they're an official brand, and they're coming back and giving people sass on Twitter. And Tesco Mobile, and you look at beef between like McDonald's and Burger King, or you look at there's a lot of these brands that aren't afraid to be cheeky, and they're multi-million pound brands, and they're putting they're accepting that risk of becoming as unprofessional, as it were. I think you've just got to do it confidently and unapologetically if it's who you are. I mean, don't force it. If it's not your sense of humour, it's not your sense of humour. But just that authenticity, like that's my sense of humour. I'm silly and I'm a little bit annoying and loud sometimes, and you've just got to be true to that, which sounds really cheesy, sorry.
No, it's very true. And I think one thing I've noted is that my organisation have it built into our brand guidelines that we can sort of push that tone a little bit if it's appropriate. And I think not everyone necessarily wants to or can do that. No. But I think, as you're saying, there are kind of ways to be more open and honest and authentic with your communications on platforms like Instagram that don't necessarily have to be sort of unprofessional if that's not you. But yeah, it's kind of, I think, yeah, what you're saying is it's good to kind of present that more honest and open approach a little bit. Yeah,
and you don't have to do it in everything. You don't have to send a newsletter out to your members saying, "Look at this badass moth, guys." Like, appropriate tones for appropriate audiences. You could actively engage with platforms like IFL Science and write a specific article for them. And that doesn't have to necessarily reach any of your core audience, but you're reaching their audience. And so it's kind of like outsourcing that in appropriate terms to reach new people.
Great. There's a question from Chloe Lewis saying, are there certain topics or types of posts that work better for drawing in younger audiences?
Ooh, that's a good shout. That's a really good point. I don't know. I tend to just post a bit of a variety, really. I think things that capture that imagination. So quite often, and it can be a bit controversial, but quite often posting photos of touching the nature, touching insects in particular, and fungi and stuff like that, because as much as people might think that there's a bit of like an ethical issue there, I think the bigger issue in society is how disconnected we are from touching nature and being in it. And I think showing photos of finding just normal insects that anybody could find if they knew how to, just on the hand, that really kind of captures people's imaginations, because it's just a thing that we don't really do anymore. And a lot of kids, unfortunately, don't have the chance to hold frogs as kids and, you know, squelch around in frog spawn and potentially eat worms. Did I do that? Maybe.
Should you look at it now? Yeah, I think some of those videos you have of just sort of having insects sort of right there, and then obviously the robin, where you have the robin coming and feeding, and it's just something so magical that I don't think a lot of people necessarily would think to do anymore. And that's something that really taps into kind of like the wonder of childhood, and that thing that we've kind of lost a little bit with our sort of nature connection.
And that's it. It's the basic bread and butter stuff that tends to be engaging. So I might get really excited about a certain like really rare beetle that I found that I'm losing my mind over, but people will just go crazy for a robin because it's something that they emotionally connect to on a regular basis. So
great. There's some questions here about user-generated content. Do you think things like photo competitions on Instagram work? Would you have any suggestions around how to engage your community?
I think so. Personally, yes, because I've kind of started from that point of view of being a person that would regularly try and engage with that type of stuff for organizations, you know, to work with and to get recognition from, you know, like Springwatch. Everyone wants a photo on Springwatch, don't they, if they're into wildlife photography? Yes, and I'd say, you know, you can be as creative with that as possible. You can do things on a theme. So everything I'm talking about here is in kind of like nature brackets, but you could, you know, best thing found in the mud in the garden, or, you know, best, I know, photos of predation, like show something a little bit unusual, not just like your standard stuff. But I think don't be afraid to share content that is exceedingly amateur, because that's often some of the best stuff. Springwatch are excellent at doing that. As much as they showcase amazing professional photography and videography, they will take a shaky photo of someone's garden of a hedgehog trying to eat a blackbird, and it's like the best thing ever. Which, if anybody saw that, it was amazing. So yeah, I think just real people filming through their phone something that they're excited about is the best UGC, in my opinion, because it's just so real and it's so accessible to other people. So yeah.
Great. Yeah, I think it'd be good to talk about some of the examples that you have prepared in a minute. But just before we do that, there's a couple of questions coming through about analytics, which we've not really covered yet. Some questions about what are the best times and dates for posting, how you sort of measure your analytics and find that kind of information out. Like, how much do you rely on that sort of stuff?
Not an awful lot, if I'm being honest. So once I passed, I think, the 10,000 follower mark, Instagram did something to me that meant I get more stats that I should supposedly know about. It's interesting to see audience breakdown. So you can see kind of your demographic of, you know, age groups and where people are from as well, which is mostly obviously the UK. Quite a lot of people from India, interestingly. So yeah, so I mean, I don't use it too much because I find you can just get sucked into this mental health wormhole of fretting about it when it doesn't really matter. I've gone on this full circle journey of trying to, you know, worry about what time to post, when to post, what to post, hashtags, and then it always just does better when it's something just coming like from pure passion, where it's not pre-planned. So I tend to just, my main focus is to just make sure I am fully connected to nature and not lose sight of it. spend my free time outside, photograph it, find interesting subjects, just be thinking about it. I just research it because I'm interested in it. And then I have just a folder on my phone that's just my favorites, that are ones that I might post at some point. And then I tend to just finish work, sit down with a brew and just type it out then and there and then post it. I don't really pre-plan and schedule because I find it's just more honest that way. And then, yeah, I don't really measure anything. Is that really bad to admit?
I think it's very different because I think from the polls that we've kind of set, we can see that a lot of people have been using Instagram for a while and are probably using it in some sort of work context. And I think as someone who does use it in a work context, there is a lot of pressure to kind of measure statistics and prove that it's having an effect and kind of like report on that. And you are very accountable to the performance, which I think it does obviously take some of the joy out of it. But, yeah, as you say, you do learn things that you potentially, it does have a positive in that it challenges your assumptions, in that you might think, you know, you might not have even considered the fact that a lot of people might be from India who follow you. But that really helps you in sort of deciding what to say to people in that kind of two-way conversation that you want to build up.
Yes, definitely.
So yeah, I think that is something that when you're doing Instagram for sort of professional capacity, you do have to kind of pay more attention. And Instagram isn't a very forthcoming channel for stats, particularly until you get to 2,000 followers, as you've mentioned. Not kind of push it on you quite a lot, which I kind of like, because I feel like Instagram's kind of resisting that pressure to kind of be really stats based, which I really enjoy.
I mean, we won't discuss the update this week because I'm really not happy at that, but yeah, I think totally get that pressure with the stats thing, but it's often helpful in my mind to take a step back, and this is in a professional capacity, not in a Lucy Lapwing capacity. Take a step back and just think, what is the end result we're trying to do by putting out this piece of comms? Are we actually trying to influence an outcome in a project on the ground? Or are we just trying to get that percentage number of the engagement rate up? Why? What is it resulting in for nature? And it just kind of takes the pressure off a bit. If you're doing stuff actually asking for an action, I think is some of the best comms you can put out. But it's really easy to just get lost in these stats and you're like, why are we doing this? Like, why do we need to get that number so high? But yeah, that's my opinion again, sorry.
No, that's fair. I think like it's really interesting to hear from you with your kind of personal Instagram approach, because quite a lot of the time you just hear from people who have been running brand accounts and for people who are running brand accounts. So it's really good to get that sort of different perspective on it. So did you want to take some more questions now, or do you want to talk about some of the accounts that have inspired you? Or how would you like to do it?
I mean, if I just do that little presentation and then
I
think that'll be really cool. I can see there's some really good questions.
Yeah, there's loads coming through. So.
Yeah, if we could start the next presentation, please. And this is just a really small handful because it's really hard to pick. But one of my favourite things about Instagram is the community on there, and I'm in awe of the absolutely amazing nature nerds on that platform, and environmental nerds and climate crisis nerds. So, I mean, some of these will be familiar to people if you're active on Instagram. So this is just some examples of how different people are doing it differently. So Sophie Pavs was one of the people that kind of inspired me to really up the ante on science comms. She probably introduced me to the world of it. Sophie did a master's in science communication, and she's a fellow nature nerd, now working for the Beaver Trust. And she just comes across with such hilarity and authenticity in her work, and she's really nailed it in the just not taking herself seriously category. Talks about British wildlife and her adventures in it. I'm really excited actually because she's doing a book next year. But so she's somebody that I think if you've not explored already, she's great because she just gets that. She captures that youthful excitement of nature and its beauty, but in like a really funny way often as well. So yeah, next slide, please. These guys I'm so excited for. This is Flock Together, who are a birding group based in London but growing, birding group for people of colour that started off with their founding members, Ollie and Nadeem. Nadeem's really quite a cool bird nerd, and he, from what I understand of their story, introduced Ollie into the world of birding. And now they've got this amazing birding club that go to all sorts of green spaces in and around London to clock birds. And it's just really refreshing to see a birding community that's not pretentious. I know that sounds really critical, but a massive focus of the work they do on Instagram is through the joy of just seeing a bird. It's not worrying about the ID or the listing or, you know, did you dip it or are you suppressing, you know, all these terms and the whole culture. It's completely just outside of that. And it's people who don't even know what the birds are, just loving watching them. And yeah, it's pure joy if you've not checked them out already. Next one. Can't remember who's next, thank you. Yeah, and there's some really, really good young people coming through, people who I wish I was that organised at their age. So James, I believe, is 18 or 19. I think he had his birthday last week. James Miller is just one example of literally hundreds of young people who've come onto Instagram. So when I started, I remember, like when I started wildlifing, should I say, on Instagram, I remember just struggling to find anyone. There wasn't an awful lot of people on there, and I really found it difficult to find wildlife pages. More and more people are joining in on that, and they are so driven for influencing change on the platform. So it's not just a presence, it's actually like as an activist. So James Miller is an absolute hero if you don't know him already. And next one, please. Yeah, and this is just to show that there's people on there that are within the outdoor sector that aren't necessarily nature conservation sector, but that are kind of tying that whole community together. So this is Sarah, who goes under the hill walking hijabi, and she's just absolutely brilliant, sharing her stories of mountain walking and hill walking in Scotland, and all about inclusivity in the outdoors. She just does some absolutely brilliant stuff. And again, she's just burst onto the scene this year, somebody who's just got that friendliness and support, and she discusses really kind of pointy topics in a really warm and loving way. And she's a really good example of somebody who's newish on the platform, who's using it to try and influence change in great ways. And I think there's one more. Yeah, so this is just a wild card I've thrown there. Nature is Metal. So this is one of my favorite, you can call it science communication pages. Not for anybody if you're squeamish. I'm going to tell you right now, do not look at this page. But it's a page that celebrates the complete brutality and reality of nature. It's chock full of predation, death, gore, parasitism, all sorts of stuff. It's right up my street, and the captions are something to behold. They're quite artistic and poetic, but also explain the nature behind what's been seen. So it's just a really good example of how we often Disneyfy nature and make it look really pretty and cute when it's actually one of the most badass things in the world. So this is a page that I just think is just brilliant, reaching new audiences with nature like we could ever wish to as a conservation organisation. And yeah, that's it. That's a few examples of just some good ones that I think are doing really good science communication on Insta.
Yeah, there are just so many, aren't there? I think it's weird for me, like Instagram seems to promote quite a strong response in terms of people's pages. And I think it's because when you go on someone's page, you can just see everything laid out in that grid and you really get kind of a sense of who they are and what they're about. Do you think it helps to have a strong theme or a strong brand for your Instagram more than other channels?
I think so. I think visually it helps things come together, and that doesn't have to be a brand with a capital B. Just a style. I'd say if you're looking to do it as a I don't know, a professional job or a hobby or anything like that, I'd say it's really good to differentiate your personal life from whatever your subject is. So I think, yeah, I don't really post anything personal on my Instagram. I keep them completely separate, and I think that just, you know, it stops that kind of, you know, muddling in. It's like a bird and an activist post and then a picture of your tea. It just seems a bit mixed up sometimes. But yeah, I'd say, yeah, branding's good. Just visually nice photos. And yeah, you can, like you said, people tend to just pick a style and stick with it, and it shines through. It doesn't necessarily have to be colour schemes or anything like that.
That's great. From the polls, it seems that the biggest problem that people have is sort of finding content and topics that work. I don't know if anyone in the comments wants to sort of post why that might be, but perhaps it could be because sometimes people have topics that aren't particularly photogenic, or you can't really take a photo of it. And I've seen that you've obviously branched into the use of illustration, and that's becoming a bigger thing on Instagram now, where people kind of tell stories through graphics and illustration, where it wasn't really make those illustrations. Do you have sort of special software you use? How does that work?
I'm just showcasing myself as a fraud here. No, I use Microsoft.
Brilliant. Oh, okay.
Freehand with my mouse. So yeah, again, throwback to MySpace days. Thank you, MySpace emo. So just drawing wildlife on there. That's just a bit of a hobby, building up my kind of interest posts. There are some great tools to do it. So if you've not got necessarily artistic mind, then I think somebody in the comments mentioned Canva, which is a really good website for making, I'm using the word assets, so like tiles and visual things where you can put information in. And I think just having that tone of voice, you know, people often start those kind of tiles, as you mentioned, with like a statement, like a really brief statement, break it down, make it simple. And in terms of content, obviously I'm always looking at it from my point of view of my hobby. I just take, I mean, my phone hates me. My phone has got something like 30,000 photos on it. It's just to be out there and immerse yourself in what you love and don't forget that end of it. And then the blogging side, whatever platform you're using, whether it's Instagram or something else, will come later as an individual, as it were. If you're an organization, again, the UGC thing is something that I can't hammer home enough. I think it's a great tool.
Just a question from Helen. You've mentioned a couple of times having notes folders, which is really interesting. I think you've kind of covered a lot about how to make Instagramming easier, but is there any other tools that you'd recommend for people?
So I just use the Notes app on my phone, and that's just where I write my captions. There's a app I use called Spacey with an IE that is to format your captions, so it's not just one solid chunk of text. You get like little paragraphs. I use InShot, which is a video editing app to edit any videos that I do, especially on Reels, because Reels is a really annoying function to actually edit in that. So I edit in InShot. And then any photo editing, I do minimal photo editing. I just like tweak the brightness and that type of thing in Instagram itself. I think it's easy, the simpler the better, really. That's it.
Yeah, there's so many different tools out there, aren't there? Like I've found that the free tools for your phone that you can edit video on is super useful. Just sort of like Adobe Rush as well, I found to be really, really great. I must admit, we haven't quite got to the stage of using Reels yet. I think it just highlights how quickly these things change and how you have to kind of keep up with it. So how would you recommend sort of venturing into new areas of Instagram?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult purely because of, I mean, politics of social media, isn't it? So Reels is Insta's answer to TikTok. I feel like I'm way too old for TikTok, but I should probably look at it. So it's difficult because that is sucking on and drawing from TikTok's own culture, which Instagram doesn't have. And that's a point of criticism from my opinion. I think it's a bit weird that we're doing that. But I'd say if there's anything new that comes along, just see, don't be afraid to lend other people's styles and move on a trend as well. Like, you know, if you've got a trend that's outside of your area, but you can apply it to your area, kind of like with memes, then do it. Why not? Yeah.
Do you think when people are shoehorning it becomes very obvious?
It depends. I mean, don't be afraid to do your own kind of theme of stuff as well. It's really hard, isn't it? I mean, it's putting that finger on authenticity and creativity. It's the magic kind of ingredients that everybody wants. Yeah. I think, yeah, just being honest and being yourself is the best way, really.
Yeah, I think with I know that whenever Instagram sort of releases a new thing that you can do, if you do that thing, you get more exposure. Yeah. So it's they kind of incentivize you to sort of start and be brave. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just that thing of it takes time to kind of investigate how the new thing works, how you do the new thing, get some plans, get some correct media for doing the new thing. I mean, for me, I find the whole portrait aspect thing really a real barrier because everything we do is filmed in landscape. And yeah, how do you kind of get around that sort of, I guess you film quite a lot of stuff directly for it, don't you? So that kind of.
Yes. So most things I do film tend to be in portrait mode anyway, because it's Instagram's thing. Yeah, I don't know. I'd say quite often we do worry more about. So this might be a personal opinion. As a consumer of media, when I'm looking at it, I'm not necessarily criticising the professionality of the media. I'm now not thinking, well, that's a bit of a skew with Horizon. Oh, well, they've filmed that and it's a bit blurry. I'm watching the subject, and I think we can get lost in how neat something has to be. I think just kind of doing it a bit more informally can work well sometimes. So, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I think
there's a lot of sort of questions coming in about reels, so I think, yeah, we've covered that off quite well. IGTV, do you want to touch on that at all? Have you used it?
Yeah, IGTV. I think it's quite a long form of media for Instagram. I've used it for the series I did earlier this year, Bird Song of the Day, which will hopefully be moving into a proper series on YouTube at some point. But yeah, it's good for just if you've got any kind of live sessions that you do. So if you do a live with another contributor, which is a really nice thing to do, you can save it on your Instagram TV. And just anything a little bit longer. So if you're doing a learning session or a Q&A session or anything like that, it's nice to upload on there. Just because your actual in-feed videos are limited to, I think it's a minute, isn't it? I don't use it a lot. I just use it when the opportunity arises, really.
Yeah, because I think there's good potential for kind of taking existing videos and putting it on Instagram TV and just kind of seeing how that goes. And it's kind of different to YouTube, isn't it? I guess it's Instagram trying to sort of take that away from YouTube to an extent. But yeah. But we've used it a bit, and it personally, I think it works quite well for longer form stuff.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So there's a question here from Laura Williams. How important is it to engage with others' accounts on top of posting and responding to comments on your own? I think that kind of leads into a question that I had about sort of the importance of building that community and sort of working with other people. How important is that?
I think really important. Again, I keep using the word authenticity today, but just naturally, as you would, I wouldn't ever comment on a person's piece or like it if I didn't genuinely like it or wasn't genuinely interested in it. So I try to be supportive. It can be difficult. It's like, how much time do you spend on it interacting with people? But if you just do it naturally, through watching people's stories and reacting to it, seeing posts and commenting on it, if you think it genuinely is interesting, just that proper human thing. And if it's a subject you're passionate about, it comes really naturally because you're interested in it. But yeah, I mean, some of the people on there that I talk to are just like blow my mind every day with information, and you know, the content they put on there is absolutely brilliant. So yeah, it's a really nice form of building community. In terms of, if you're talking about, is it important? That's kind of, is it morally important? Is it important to do with your success? Possibly. It might influence Instagram's algorithms if you're more interactive with people. I'm not entirely sure, but I tend to do it from a point of view of just genuinely liking and supporting someone.
Yeah, it's just so different, isn't it, when you're doing it from your personal account than if you're a sort of brand tasked with getting exposure and trying to work out how to do that. I think, yeah, as we said, you can kind of lose sight of just the brilliance of engaging with people for the sake of it, rather than just trying to get exposure. So as a brand, one of the things that I would like to do more is collaborate with independent people who are really passionate about nature, who are science communicators. How would you suggest that organisations approach that?
I think it's something categorically the sector does not do enough of. I think the way to gain brand awareness and authenticity isn't necessarily, if you think of a person who sat there scrolling through social media and they've never heard of the RSPB or WWT or the Wildlife Trusts, and a branded account comes up with our little logo and it's got a post about a blue tit or whatever, or a duck, and it's just like blah, 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 probably skim past it. But if they're talking to their sister or their friend or the mate and they're like, you know, I'm doing this stuff for this amazing charity and, you know, about birds, or they see it on their own friend's account, that's a connection with the brand more than I think the content we produce as the brand itself that's ever going to reach. And if you've got somebody who is enthusiastic, got the time to create their own content, willing to support you as a brand, and somebody that you know that you can trust to be as professional as they need to be, we'll go back to professionality, but somebody who's not going to go off, you know, and get an interview on BBC News about something really controversial, then leave it in their hands. Like, give them a vague topic and a brief and say, make your own thing. And if you think, particularly Instagram is just full of like proper influencers, not small fry like me, like people with hundreds of thousands and millions of followers who are getting paid by like Nike and Gucci and whoever knows else to flog stuff and wear stuff. If those brands with that big of a name can trust some random person to take photos of them wearing or using whatever, we as an organisation can trust somebody who's enthusiastic about birds to talk about birds. And I think we need to affiliate more with these people, use them as ambassadors, help, you know, increase their skills as volunteers, work with them to get them experience in incomes if that's what they want to go into, and trust them to talk naturally and passionately about something that really matters to them. I think more people need to do it more.
I think that's a really good point, because they obviously just do have that freedom to sort of show their personality and have that aspect that a brand just can't do a lot of the time. I think as NGOs or charities or organizations that don't have a lot of money, obviously Nike have a lot of money to pay these influencers. So you mentioned kind of ambassadors. Is that kind of how you'd recommend building those relationships between organizations and individuals?
And I'd say that it's a unique gift that that the environmental sector has, is that people are in it for wanting to influence change. So they're not influencers after cash. They're people who want to work in the sector, be activists in the sector, influence change in the sector. And an affiliation with an organisation is something really beneficial to people. It might sound quite like egotistical, but it's not. Like, people want to, if they believe in their own communication skills, they want to represent a cause that they're passionate about. I mean, I do. So I'm an ambassador for the Beaver Trust, because I mean, beavers, they're amazing. I don't need to sell them to you, I'm sure, but you know, I'm proud to be an ambassador for a charity that's working in some really amazing conservation projects. And so I will naturally talk about it and naturally share the word about it in a way that perhaps the charity's own page couldn't reach, in a tone of voice that you can reach. So yeah, I'd say, you know, working with people as volunteers, making sure it's a two-way relationship. How do you develop their skills and experience? How do you give them opportunities within the organisation? You know, perhaps they can come and visit conservation projects. Perhaps they can represent you in the media. You could give them training to be, you know, do TV interviews, whatever you want. And in return, they'll, you know, if you've got a campaign, you give them the down low on it, and then they go off and create some amazing content on things like TikTok, but we're not even on. Yeah.
I think TikTok is just, you know, it's almost more extreme, the issue that we have with Instagram and kind of that kind of comedy element. It's so hard for brands to kind of, unless they're naturally in that space, to kind of translate to TikTok in that way. And I think, yeah, that's a whole other kettle of fish, isn't it?
Definitely.
That's super interesting, though. I think, yeah, it's always just hard to know how to approach people, and you obviously really want to work with people and make too much time when they're kind of essentially giving up their time for free to help you out with something. But I think that's really interesting what you said about the value exchange, and kind of making it sort of a really nice, authentic collaboration. You must get a lot of requests through from people. So how do you kind of how do you manage that?
Requesting what sense, sorry?
To work with people, or sort of, Lucy, can you help us with this, that sort of thing?
Yeah. It's hard, because I am the worst person in the world at saying no. So I take on too much and then burn out, and then I try and just be completely just stick to a certain thing and say that, you know, not bend the rules. So I try and exclusively work British conservation and wildlife. I don't do any brand or product promotion, because there's enough stuff in the world. Nobody needs any more stuff. I'm not selling it. And if it's a cause that I'm particularly passionate about, then I'm happy to work with people with it. But that's probably why I keep burning out. But yeah, that's it.
I think obviously so many great people out there. I think you just need somebody who's really passionate about your cause and start that dialogue with them and not worry too much about offending them or anything like that. There's a question here about something called Instagram guides. Do you know what this is, Lucy?
Not a clue. I saw that. Don't ask me that one.
Much more advanced. The advanced Instagram session. Yeah, but definitely we'll look into that now. We're getting quite close to time. Is there anything you particularly wanted to talk about, Lucy?
I don't think so. I feel like I've just rambled a lot, but I mean, I'm always happy to just talk to people. If anybody's got any questions that I didn't answer, then feel free to drop me a message on Instagram. I'm happy to just support people. I find there's not enough kind of lifts up in the sector, so I try and focus time on particularly if younger people get in touch, I'll sit and have a Zoom session with them and talk to them about the sector and about Insta and what we can do. So if anybody needs a chat or any advice, I think.
If you just offered more of your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone turning up as well. I'm chuffed to bits. You listen to me just chatting rubbish about wildlife, but
yeah, it's been a really great session. Thank you for everyone and all your interesting questions. We do have 3 minutes left.
Happy to fit a couple more in if you can.
Let me see. Is there anything that?
Bye everyone.
There's quite a lot. Most of it we've kind of already covered off. There was a question about audiences. Do you find that there's any sort of audience trends as to your accounts, or is there anything? I know you mentioned India.
That's only a very small kind of percentage, but I don't know. Instagram's a younger-ish person's platform, so there's a lot of younger people on there. A lot of people kind of going into conservation right at the beginning of the education route. So that's really nice to see people go from perhaps not knowing a blue tit from a great tit to becoming proper bird nerds. It's always really satisfying to see. So yeah, really nice audience is what I'd say.
I've definitely found that, having worked on it. I've only worked on it for a year really, but just that kind of breadth of people, and it's, you might have a science background but sort of just be going into communicating, or you might have a communicating background but be really interested in science, and that kind of thing doesn't really matter. It's just quite a nice community.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm sort of glad that I've had that experience now. Yeah, I think we're pretty much done. I don't know if we've got 2 more minutes.
Yes.
We can probably just finish if we're done. But yeah, thanks so much everyone for this session. We really enjoyed it.
Enjoy the rest of Communicate.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.